Thank you, David. I'm just getting ready to text you. We get it.
For Senate Appropriations, February 24th, 2022, Senator Guru,
Excused.
Senator Hicks,
Excused.
Senator Kinski,
Here.
Senator Steinmetz, Chairman Perkins,
Here.
you have a quorum.
Thank you. First bill for our consideration. Let's do, we'll do Senate File 79, Prohibition on Private Funds for Conducting Elections. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an old friend from last year, and all we're trying to do is prohibit private funds from influencing Wyoming elections. It's something that our good Secretary of State has been working on election integrity across the state. We have great elections in the state of Wyoming. We're just seeking to keep them that way. As you remember, the bill does exempt out that, when we're doing election training or some of those other things are happening at the Secretary of State level or the county clerk level, or even on election day, food and beverages and things like that for poll workers or election staff is exempted out. This is really designed to keep those larger nonprofits who have influenced elections in other states out of Wyoming elections, and just make sure that we're protected here and keep our good elections going forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and open up public comment. Is there anybody from Secretary of State's office? Here, come on up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. My name is Kai Schoen, Election Director in the Secretary of State's office. And Senate File 79 is exactly how Senator Steinmetz summarized it. And this bill really is in line with what's already current practices. Not seeing evidence of this happening, but protects our office, protects the county clerks and other political subdivisions and whatnot involved in elections from being influenced in those ways. We saw some of that in 2020, not in our state, but other states receiving money from big tech and social media. And so this really protects us on the books. The carve-out exception, that certainly works well for our office. We actually in 2016 had the opportunity to leverage some private funds to put on a symposium for youth voters. We had over 400 in attendance. It was a great event, and it was for education. And so we do appreciate that carve-out exception, and I would answer any questions the committee might have for me.
Okay, so just a couple of questions as we go through this, and whether it's you or Senator Steinmetz, Kai. So on get out the vote efforts that are not under the badge or umbrella of either the local, usually it's our county clerks. It's not under their umbrella. They're still able to do those types of things. Or are there limits on what those types of things can look like under this bill?
Mr. Chairman, it doesn't, get into, those kind of efforts on the side or third parties, whatnot, engaging in their own First Amendment rights. So it doesn't touch that.
And so then this also doesn't affect if somebody wants to bring cookies for the election judges on election day, and they bring in a plate of cookies and leave it there for them to eat. Does it affect anything like that?
Mr. Chairman, it does not.
Okay. All right. And what about some of the other, what about if folks wanted to run a bus from assisted living home down, bring some senior citizens or other folks struggling a little bit to come down to the polls? Anything wrong with that?
Mr. Chairman, great question. And no, it does not touch that either.
All right. All right. Thank you. I don't have any questions. Go ahead, Senator Kinski.
Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you being here. And I don't know whether this question's for you or for Senator Steinmetz, but Senator Beitman will be familiar with this situation. The 1 cent, we have two different penny taxes in Sheridan. And it used to be that the Chamber of Commerce would start a PAC, raise money, and campaign for renewal. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, somebody gave the county commissioners the opinion that if it was just an education campaign, and they never used the word vote for or against that they could spend government money.
Hmm.
So since then, there's been about $30,000 to $50,000 of government spending on renewal of the 1 cent. But it's fashioned as just, we want to educate you on all the good things that the 1 cent does for our community, which, sounds valid enough, but I've always been a little bit queasy about the amount of money that goes into it, knowing it's really aimed at renewal, and I favor renewal. Would this bill prohibit that practice?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, the way that I read this bill, I don't believe it addresses that specifically. That could be one of those areas, again, that you got to bring the legal minds together and see, are we crossing that line or not? But this doesn't specifically address that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Senator Steinmetz, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to reiterate, this bill is very narrowly crafted toward our county clerks and secretary of state in conducting the election process, if that helps clarify a little bit. Correct, Mr. Chairman. Correct.
Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right. You're right on the money. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, that's all that I have.
On Senate File 79. Yes, please come up. And if somebody else is going to come up, please grab another chair, one or two over, and we'll get this done. Go ahead. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Senators. I'm Mary Langford, and I have the honor of representing the county clerks of the state of Wyoming. I have really nothing to add to Kai's testimony from the Secretary of State. We have really seen no evidence of this in our state, and we have really no concern.
Okay,
So we appreciate that.
thank you. Any
Thank you.
questions? Any questions? Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
testimony this morning.
Yep.
It's a bright, crisp morning. Any other testimony on 79? Any other testimony on 79? One final time. Any other testimony on 79 for or against? All right, we'll close off public testimony. Committee, what's your pleasure? Got a motion and a second. Any discussion or amendments? Any discussion or amendments? Question being called. Please call the roll.
Thank you. On Senate File 79, Senator Guru left a proxy aye vote. Senator Hicks. Aye. Senator Kinski.
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz. Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
5 aye.
All right. Thank you very much. Next bill for our consideration, Senate File 108. Senator Whiteman, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. I bring to you Senate File 108. The goal of the bill is similar to the bill we passed the last general session. I know it seems like a long time ago, back in 21, that dealt with discriminatory practices by financial institutions with firearms. What this bill does is it expands that to include the use of social credit scores, or ESG, which means environmental, social justice, or governmental metric scores. So basically what the bill does, if you look at page 1, we're going into that same section that we created last general session and add social credit scores, use prohibited. And what we're trying to do is protect people from being discriminated against. I haven't had enough coffee this morning. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. From their financial institutions based on this subjective social credit score and ESG score, their posts on social media, participation in any membership or group, union, political affiliation, employer, or any other values-based criteria similar to a social credit score. If you recall, here recently up in Ottawa, Canada, the peaceful protesters up there had their bank accounts frozen. And how that was able to happen was because the financial institutions colluded with the government to go in and freeze these people's accounts. It's a dangerous precedent. We're seeing more and more of it. Another example would be Mike Lindell with MyPillow got debanked because of his political views. Scary stuff. Stuff we don't want in the state of Wyoming, and we need to protect our citizens. And we also need to protect not only our firearms industry, but we need to start thinking about protecting our coal, our oil and gas, fossil fuel industries that are falling out of favor with the political elites on each coast. That would destroy our economy. Imagine if our oil and gas industry got completely debanked, or our fossil fuels. It would wreck Wyoming. So businesses and individuals need to be protected. And that's what this bill does, Mr. Chairman. And so with that, I'll just stand for any questions. I know there's going to be some really good testimony. Betty Grandy is on. She's an expert on this. And I'm looking forward to hearing her testimony and answering any questions you may have.
All right.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Kinski.
So Senator Biden, I like it when people younger than me tell me terms I've never heard of before, like social credit scores. So I'm trying to get my head around it. So if I understand it, what you're aiming at is say a bank that won't extend credit to somebody because on their social media, they cruise sites that to them indicate they might be a bad credit risk. That they have an algorithm that says anybody who goes these kind of sites is generally a bad credit risk. Anybody who goes those kind of sites is generally a good credit risk. Is that what we're talking about? Because that's usually all banks care about, is whether they're going to get their money back.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, in a perfect world, ideally that would a credit risk. If banking based on credit risk is what we want, we don't want banking based on politics or anything else other than whether or not you're credit worthy. What we're seeing is the opposite happening. And it's been kind of brewing about for the last few years, but it's starting to come to a head now. And so what you're seeing is based on no other criteria other than, say, my example about fossil fuels. There are banks out there that said they will not lend to fossil fuels. Not because they're not credit worthy, but because they just politically disagree with fossil fuels. Same thing with like the Mike Lindell example. He's a conservative Trump supporter, got debanked just based on his political views. Not because MyPillow is a failing company and they're, not credit worthy, just based on that. So that's what we're getting at here, is those kind of subjective criteria, not credit worthiness.
Thank you, Mr.
Go ahead,
Chairman.
continue.
So Mike Lindell, his deal wasn't because they cruised his choices on the internet. It was just because he was very public and very outspoken. That was clear retaliation. If you've seen news articles or something where they highlight, an individual who was denied credit based on an institution saying, we don't like this guy's views on firearms, or we don't like this individual, because this is really aimed, I think, at individuals. Because I don't want to vote for a bill that is in search of a problem. If we've got some documentation where individuals have been denied credit based on what banks saw in their social media behavior, that's what I'd like to see, if you can. And then I'll follow up with another one after that.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, I'd be happy to email you some data on that. And if social media posts is giving you a heartache, I'd be fine taking that out for now because it's such an important bill. Otherwise, if social media is what's hanging you up on this bill, we could take that out, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Follow on. Because, for me, the local media is really the arbiter of truth in my world. That was a joke.
I know. Once again, not enough coffee, sir.
So go to page 3, line 22. Analysis of the person's bank and credit card activities. What bothers me is I don't want that to comprehend, because among my credit card activities are paying my credit card and paying it on time, or not paying my credit card at all. And so I'm concerned where there is something that is genuinely reflective of credit worthiness, that is paying or not paying your bills on time. I worry about this language being too broad and prohibiting things that can and should be permissible. So I don't think you intend to prohibit them from looking at their payment history, do you, by that phrase?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kansky, no, trying to take into account, say, a bank looking through your financial transactions to track firearm purchases or ammunition purchases. That's the intent of this paragraph. So any kind of, whether, I use firearms as an example, we passed that law last year, so that's taken care of. But what about union dues? What about political donations?
Okay.
Things of that sort. So they can kind of analyze your behavior, looking at your bank account statements, see how your patterns are. And then if they decide, well, we don't like you because of that, go find a new bank.
Okay.
And we got problems.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So you're saying we should use cash or blockchain?
Mr. Chairman, blockchain is starting to sound much better. I might need to get into that. I don't know, but
So I guess, so this is, I mean, I get the banking services. I get checking, the bills types of transactions. I get that. But when we get to the other services, particularly in lending services, there are certain standards. Obviously, you can't discriminate based on race, these other mutable characteristics that has been extended over some period of time, because those things don't necessarily have to do with credit worthiness. But banking's changed some. But I grew up the son of a banker and watched that. And there's a little bit of a black art in being a banker and making kind of subjective decisions about. I know it's changing, but it used to be they'd sit across, they'd look at you, they're evaluating how you talk, how you look, how you react to questions, and they just, some of it's just a gut feeling of whether they're a good credit risk or not. How do we legislate or govern that kind of activity and that personal edge, the personal part of the banking, which particularly in lending situations?
that's a great question, Mr. Chairman. And I think we tried to address that on page 3 and lines 1 through 8 in subparagraph B, where you can offer products and services that do include subjective standards, provided that everything's up front and fully disclosed when you enter into this banking relationship. So kind of gives a little bit of leeway there, but it doesn't cut you off after you've already, say you've gone all in and you're doing a multi-million-dollar project, and then halfway through the deal, you get debanked. That's what I'm trying to stop from happening. So I hope that subparagraph B does that. If it doesn't, I'd be open for amendments on how to better word that. You're an excellent wordsmith, Mr. Chairman, and be looking for help on that if need be.
Okay, well, maybe there's some testimony to help us flesh that out a little bit more. Anything else for Senator Biden? Anybody else have any questions for Senator Biden? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll open up for testimony on Senate File 108. Is anybody from the banking division here? Come on up, please. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Nick Rothschadel. I am the General Counsel at the Wyoming Division of Banking. With me today to my left is Jeremiah Bishop. Mr. Bishop is the Deputy Commissioner for the Division of Banking, and he oversees the supervision and examination of our state chartered banks and trust companies. I would like to provide you with some initial short background on the Division of Banking, and then we would like to make 3 points on the text of the bill. And then, of course, we can stand for any questions that you may have. As initial background, as you probably all know, the Division of Banking supervises and examines state chartered banks and trust companies that would be subject to this bill. The division's role includes consumer and bank depositor protection. We consider maintaining access to financial services to be an important part of protecting consumers and businesses, protecting their access to financial services. We do appreciate the bill and the sponsor having expressed an interest in protecting access to financial services for Wyoming consumers and businesses. Our comments on the proposed bill arise from our role in supervising and examining state banks and state charter trust companies. We have identified potential ambiguities or inconsistencies in the text of the bill, so that when the division is evaluating whether a state bank or a state charter trust company is in compliance with this law, if it were to pass, these areas, 3 areas, are potentially unclear to us. So we want to raise those with you today. And I'll go into those 3 now and stand for any questions. First, there is an inconsistency where one spot in the bill refers to any person or business entity, and other spots in the bill only refer to person. So I'll direct you to page 2, lines 2 to 4. Subsection A here states, no financial institution shall discriminate against any person or business entity based on a person's or businesses, and then the bill goes on. I would contrast that with page 3, lines 1 through 3, subsection B. It says, notwithstanding subsection A of this section, a financial institution may offer any person, and this section does not refer at all to business or business entity. And then I'd also direct you to page 3, lines 19, 20, and 22, which again all refer to person and not to business or business entity. So the division would just ask that this committee review whether this inconsistency is intended or not.
Quick question
Go ahead.
about that. So when we get into, I'm assuming that the 13, Title 13 has to do with banking. And so in there, when we talk about a person in that context, is there a definition of person in there? And does it, which generally includes individuals, and it's very expansive, it includes the individuals as well as business entities. Is that applicable in Title 13?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I don't recall offhand if we have a definition of person, but our view would be that person includes both a individual person and a business entity.
Just any entity that exists under the law, whether it's an individual or any kind of any association, partnership, anything, those are all persons.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
And if I may, I know my colleague has something to add to that.
Thank you.
We always allow you to phone a friend.
Thank
This
you.
committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like I said, I'm Jeremiah Bishop, Deputy Commissioner. I had one thing on that point. There are other areas in Title 13 where it may not be an express definition, but an inconsistency such as this is viewed as on purpose, and therefore we have to view it differently.
Exactly.
So
I get it.
just to clarify, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Continue. That was one. You got a couple more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second one, I will point you to subsection B on page 3, lines 1 through 8. This appears to be a carve out from the prohibition in subsection A. If the division needs to determine if a state chartered bank or trust company falls within this carve out in subsection B, it's not currently clear to us exactly what this carve out is intended to cover. For example, subsection B refers to the phrase subjective standards in 2 different ways. Page 3, lines 3 to 4 refers to investments, products, and services that include subjective standards. But then page 3, lines 4 to 5 refers to subjective standards used by the financial institution. What is the difference between a subjective standard included in a product versus a subjective standard used by a financial institution? I don't have an answer to that. We are just trying to get some clarification if and as this bill moves forward on what is the intent of subsection B, because that would help us in the future when we need to review whether a state chartered bank or trust company would fall within this carve out.
And maybe we can just ask a question about that. So when we talk about subjective standards, and maybe Jeremiah can help us with this, that, you know, what I think that it's kind of those things we were just talking about a minute ago, those kind of those personal judgments that the individual banker makes, particularly whether an investment's appropriate or lending in particular. And so just maybe you could help us with that. I mean, what are the things that are permissible for lenders to look at in under this realm of subjective standards, or if there's another term that's more appropriate, let us know about that too.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that is a very broad term. And it comes up very frequently. Now, there are already certain things that they cannot include in subjective standards. They're all from the prior session against firearms, race, sex, education, things like that. They cannot prohibit. But like you said, there are a lot of things that go into deciding, especially on the lending side, that could be arguably as subjective standards. Each bank has different policies and risk thresholds. It's usually tied to risk. And so our standpoint, again, it goes in documentation. We always tell banks, document everything. If you decide to extend a loan, document why. If you don't document everything. Because that definition of subjective standard is just so vague. This could put, a lot of things could be included in what a subjective standard is. I don't know if that
And I think that's helped. And I think that therein lies the struggle that I think that both the proponents of the bill and just as we analyze it, I think that's what it is. So we look down at this thing. And so you look at, for example, let's look at this. Let's look at line 12 on page 2, social media posts. And so one of the things that they can't discriminate based on social media posts, but yet social media posts can disclose, hey, man, I've got a great trip to Vegas and, and I'm going to take company, people post crazy things on, I know lots of rent. I know lots of lease lessors, landlords will review social media posts to see what kind of fruit it is. And if they've got somebody's a big partier or drinker and are talking about how they got high on the weekend or something like that, that may not be a very good, that's not a very good factor that you want necessarily. I guess it depends on what kind of landlord you are, but most landlords wouldn't look very particularly favorable on that, where someone else lives with a cat and goes to church on Sundays and that's what they post about. So, I'm just trying to figure out. So we say you can't look at social media posts, but then we're allowing subjectivity in this sense. And I think therein lies the issue. And so as we do that, if I don't know, and I guess that's your question, is how do we analyze that situation? What's the guidance that we do on it?
Yes, exactly.
And you would have the opportunity to promote regulations that flesh that out. So how would help it if there's anything you have to suggest or could help us through understand how this might work? I know I'm not asking you to do that, but just as a regulator and how they're putting that, you're going in to analyze a business in the context of those. What are the types of things that you might be looking at in formulating rules to decide to try and enforce the statute?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just start and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Jeremiah Bishop to answer and provide any clarification. Right now, because we don't, I don't think we fully understand the intent of the draft of the bill. I don't know that we're in a position to say, here's how we would promulgate any rules if we chose to promulgate rules in relation to this bill. What we would do is evaluate the final bill, what is said about the bill during the legislative session to try to better understand what's the purpose of this bill and align our rules with what the policy is intended to be.
Go ahead, Senator
Oh,
Steinmetz.
I didn't mean to interrupt you if you had a follow-up. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I think we're just having this discussion about that. If you've got something to add, please jump in.
Well, mine's a little different. I was just wondering about the employer because I think no financial institution shall discriminate against any person or business entity based on a person's. And then you go clear down to 6, and that's employer. And so any loan document I've ever filled out or anything with the bank has always asked for my employer, would this prohibit that? How exactly would that work?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Yes, that is also an unclear area. That is a thing that is always looked at in a loan, as some of the bankers I think will also testify. Your employer, how long you've been at that employer, and then getting back to Mr. Sherman's question about like character and where do you draw that line of what a bank is allowed to use and not allowed to use with this language. A little more clarification would definitely help.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Kinsky.
So I'm going to turn the lens around the other way and ask you, one, if you've seen stories in the media about this kind of thing that cause you concern, and if you've seen regulations like this in other states that have been vetted through the legislative process and the banking process and have made it into the books that address all these concerns. Is there a model we can look somewhere in your experience that achieves what this bill is trying to do?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, thank you for the question. On your first question regarding whether we have seen essentially this issue, our focus is on Wyoming state charter banks and state chartered trust companies. I'm not familiar with any evidence of this being an issue among the entities that we regulate. On your second question about has this been approved or passed in other states, I am aware of 2 other states that have had this bill before them or a similar bill. I don't believe those states passed the bill. Relatedly, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, it's not a bill, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the OCC, regulates national banks. They did propose a rule, and that rule is nearly finalized, attempting to address discrimination based on factors other than quantitative metrics. A different approach, and that rule is not currently effective.
Follow on, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, go ahead.
I'd ask if information about that promulgation of the rule at the national level, if you might just forward some links to me, and would you want the same thing, Senator Beitman? If you could forward that to myself and Senator Beitman, that would be helpful. If somebody's already plowed this ground, it'd be nice to see.
Yes.
The discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, we will provide that to you.
All right, thank you. Would be helpful. Anything else on point 2? I think you still have one more for us.
Nothing else on point, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Nothing else on point 2. I think our final point really is just echoing something that was already discussed, which is the division believes the definition of social credit score I believe it's at the bottom of page 3, merits a close analysis of each word by this committee. Banks already have scores, rankings, numbers, and other metrics that they assign to a person based on a person's actions that are required by an analysis of the person's financials, including bank and credit card activities. In some cases, those scores, rankings, numbers, or metrics may have been used for decades or a number of years by the bank. The division's assumption is that this provision is not intended to result in a situation where the division is finding Wyoming banks in violation of Wyoming law for using the financial metrics that they have used for years in determining, for example, whether to provide a loan to a business. As an example, most banks will have something they might call a borrower's internal rating, borrower's grade, or something similar. These will vary by bank, but they, again, are a number acquired based on a person's actions, acquired by analyzing the person's financials. Even a traditional credit score, obviously used by banks, that's a number based on a person's actions that is acquired by an analysis of the person's bank and credit card activities. So it's not my goal to parse every word in this definition unless you really want me to do that. The division would merely urge this committee to review whether there's any potential this definition of social credit score inadvertently encompasses financial data and metrics that banks already use, and whether this needs to be tightened up to more closely align with what is the intent of the bill and the sponsor's intent in preparing this bill. So that's a third point. With that, I'll stop, and my colleague and I are happy to take any further questions.
One more question while we've got you here, and that is, other than the firearm issue that we passed, I think, a year ago, is there any other area in this kind of credit score lender customer analysis that where Wyoming banks and charter trust institutions differ from national banks? So in other words, just trying to figure out the standard of charter banks compared to national banks. And it may be a general comment overall, but if there's anything, I'm just trying to wonder how far apart we are and what those divergences are.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my knowledge, other than the firearms bill passed a year ago, that is the only state level prohibition that I'm aware of. That's different from state chartered banks to national chartered banks. There are plenty of national regulations on prohibition, like I said, against age, race, sex, things like that. But that's national. Every bank has to follow that. So I think the firearm bill is the only one that I'm aware of at this time.
And obviously, I think our goal is, I think as I understand Senator Beitman's goal is, he's trying to say free speech on itself shouldn't be a factor. There's got to be some other qualitative metric or something assigned other than just a free speech position that denies the person's ability to bank. I think that's what he's trying to do. So we'll continue to work. If you have any suggestions for us, let us know. Okay. Anything other questions for these good fine gentlemen this morning? Thank you very much. Appreciate your time this morning. Scott, you got something for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Scott Meyer, President and CEO of the Wyoming Bankers Association, and I represent approximately 30 members or 30-member banks around the state of Wyoming. Predominantly, they are the community banks that are chartered in Wyoming. There are 2 or 3 of the national banks that are also our members. I have with me also Mr. Tom Bass. He is the chairman of our board that maybe understands a little bit about maybe some of the metrics that you've talked about in general.
Come on up, Tom. Take a seat in case he needs to phone a friend. It'll save us. Yeah. Go ahead, Scott.
I will tell you that I come before this committee to tell you that we are here to express our opposition to this bill. I will tell you that I think that we probably have, and I know I personally do, but we have probably more in alliance with the good bringer of the bill than most people probably realize. We think that we understand exactly the situation, and we are supportive of what the bringer of the bill is wanting to do. And we understand that in our position is that banks and businesses in general should not discriminate based upon these subjective standards like social media posts and what have you. I will echo a little bit of I'll echo a lot of what the Division of Banking says on the discrepancies and how we define things. And I won't go over all that again, just because we've already heard that. But what the title of this bill suggests is that, that there is a problem out there. And I'm not so sure that really we have that problem. But if in fact there is, that this legislation may go beyond that. Senate File 10108 does not define some of these terms that you guys have brought up, and I think that's a big concern as to what is exactly a social credit score. I don't know how you go through that. There's a lot of factors, I guess, that each individual bank that may have to look at that. I will kind of take off a little bit off the comment that Chairman Perkins made regarding his father, and the old adage was that that banks look at 3 C's. They look at the collateral that you're proposing for a loan. They look at the capacity to repay, and they look at the character of the person. And more often than not, that character of the person is revealed in a lot of different ways, and banks make their decisions based upon that. We just recently recognized one of the chairmen of one of our local community banks for over 50 years. That chairman has been in banking so long that he pretty much can tell just by looking at you and talking to you, whatever, whether you're a good credit risk. It has nothing to do with what's on a social media post or maybe some position that you've taken or what political party you're affiliated with. They just know where this is and what kind of risk is. And that's really what your banks are doing, is assessing the risk of what's happening here. I will tell you that that subjective attitude is you can figure out, everybody's going to have their own definition. We have recently, and you were all aware of it, but one of the national banks, who is not a member of my organization, by the way, that made the decision that they don't want to have to deal with fossil fuels. Well, I don't think we can legislate against being stupid and maybe poor business decisions, and yet they do. And fine, they do whatever they're going to do, and they'll live by the sword or die by the sword. That is not our concern. Our concern is making sure we provide the citizens of Wyoming the best banking opportunities, regardless of the industry that you have out there. And we've brought up, this is part of that firearms bill, and we had some discussions about that last year as well. That banks will do what they have to do with regarding the best customers and the best assessment of risks that they have. And that's how banks will work. A lot of the discussion, and I think the Division of Banking brought it up, but we believe this bill is also unnecessary because banks already they're already over-regulated. They've already have so many criteria they have to meet. For example, they have the Community Reinvestment Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and the Fair Housing Act, all to make sure that they're not discriminating against anybody. And that is something that the banks have to deal with daily. And they have regulators that come to make sure that they're doing this. And that's what the regulators do, either from the state level or if you're a national bank from the national level. But they look at this and making sure that the banks are not doing stuff that would be on this social credit score, that they don't have something identified in that. They may have their own internal matrix of how they do that, but that's the business, it's the bank's decision on how they want to run their business and assess that credit risk. And that's really where it comes down to. There were a few comments that were made, and I'll just point out that there were some funds, and we talked about the Canadian truckers. Well, all those funds have now been released once they cleared out that protest, but that was done by an emergency act by the government. It was not done by the banks. So that is a deal that the government did, not the banks. The banks didn't go in there and freeze anybody's account, so you can't have that kind of stuff. And there are plenty of banks that have made their social position known, as we talked a little bit last year with the firearms discrimination bill. Now here's another one. We can't, like I said, we can't regulate whether they're going to make good business decisions or not. Some of them will, and they're free to do that. But your Wyoming banks don't do that kind of thing. And I think that the Division of Banking brought up a very interesting point that I would like to focus on, and that is they regulate the state charter banks. That's where our legislation here is aimed at. And there's no evidence that I know of that the state charter banks are doing any of this stuff. So you look at it and you say, what are they going to do? Are we going to try to regulate some of the national banks? We don't have any of that ability here. So I think that the bill goes a little bit too far in that, and it has some potential for some unintended consequences. And one of those is I think is that they refer to that if you have a problem with this or you think that you've been discriminated against, then you can refer to section 1310-303, which my position would be that if this bill moves forward, I'd like to see that whole section for firearms and for this kind of stuff. This allows an individual citizen to just file a suit with or without basis, and all of us who practice law know And you can file a suit, doesn't mean it's going to stay in there, but you can do whatever it is that you want to do and file a lawsuit. It's not the question of whether that suit would stand up in court or whether that has merit, it's the PR. And that's where you're going to give public relations to nightmares to all lending institutions, whether they be banks or credit unions or anything else. This bill goes way too far because it allows these people to do stuff. As much as I detest the idea that somebody would make that kind of a decision based on a social credit score, you could have somebody that makes that accusation that has absolutely no bearing on it. And you've already created the nightmare because it ends up in front of on the Tribune, Eagle page, front page, or the Casper Star. I think that those are things that we need to really consider. So with that, I would certainly stand for any questions. I just think at this point in time, there's more damage to be done with this bill for your Wyoming bankers than there would be for any positive benefit.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Scott Meyer? Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Anyone else wish to tell? Did you have anything? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Tom Bass. I've been a banker for 43 years. I agree with the banking division. I agree with Mr. Meyer.
I'd hope you do. He's your lobbyist.
And there are customers that I might not agree with their political views, but if they're a good credit risk, I will do the loan. I don't discriminate on that. I know Mr. Meyer talked about a super regional bank a few years ago that didn't want to do anything with fossil fuels. If a legal company came in and they met all our metrics, we would do the loan. And I testified last year about the firearms also. And we would do that also if the legal company came in and they met our metrics, we would do the loan.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for this witness? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else to testify on this bill on Senate File 108? Anyone else to testify on 108? Anybody in the room?
Mr. Chairman, I have two people online who wish to
All right, if
testify.
you're
I'll
in
go
the-
ahead and bring them in. I
Anybody
believe
either-
we'll start with
Thank you.
Mike Carone, and then we'll hear from Betty Grant.
Who's the second one? Betty Grant. All right, thank you. Mike Thoreau.
Great, thank you. I'll begin. Good morning, Chairman Perkins, Chairman Nicholas, and members of the Appropriations Committee. I'm Mike Carone with the Consumer Data Industry Association. We represent the consumer reporting industry. We're based out of Washington, D.C. We were founded in 1906. In addition to representing consumer reporting agencies, we also represent the nationwide credit bureaus, regional and specialized credit bureaus, and background check and residential screening companies, among others. I'm here today to testify on Senate File 0108. As we know, prohibits financial institutions from using social credit scores. As has been noted by some other parties that testified before me, we feel the definition of a social credit score is drafted too broadly and includes and likely includes the use of legitimate credit information that's heavily regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, in addition to some other federal regulations. We do not have an issue with a true social credit score being prohibited, but based on this definition, we feel that it's a little too broad and includes legitimate information that's currently being used in states around the country. We also want to note that this is, with it being somewhat of a new issue over the last couple of years and its usage in other countries to discriminate, that it's a tough subject matter to regulate right now. And I've communicated with some of the sponsors on this, and I've gone back with our attorneys and our member companies, and it's really difficult to kind of pinpoint this down. I mean, one thing we'd like to note is that if we could just limit it to true social media activity or anything outside of legitimate credit information and financial information, that would be great. But it's a tough definition to pinpoint exactly and limit. And we're working through some items, but unfortunately, We don't have anything solidified yet, and your session is a very quick one up there this year. More time would be ideal here to work on this, but respectfully, right now, we would have to oppose the bill as currently drafted and respectfully request more work be done on the bill and the definition of social media credit scores to truly limit that to social media activity that is not something that is not currently regulated at the federal level, at least from my knowledge. In addition to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there's also the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, and others. But thank you for the consideration of our comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you. And so is Ms. Grant on, is Ms. Grant, are you there?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I am.
Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I had sent my testimony and some extra information to the entire committee earlier today. I hope you have received it upon your emails. I won't take up a lot of your time in reading that testimony, as I know that you, as a former legislator, I know you're capable of reading without me having to read it to you. I'm going to just jump right to some of the questions and issues that were brought up by the banking industries so that we can work through some of this process. Number one, the inconsistencies of person and business entities. Feel free to edit to add in business entity and make it the same all the way through. I think it's a very simple fix on your side. Part two, the carve out on subject evaluation or subject standards. I think if you went with subject standards, that's something they're used to dealing with and shouldn't be an issue. I agree with Senator Beitman that social posts could certainly be removed if that is necessary and reevaluated after a year's time to see if it's been a problem or needs to be defined and put back in. For number three on the rules, wanting to the social credit score definition side. I think that's a really interesting discussion. It's a discussion I've been having for months with a lot of states and other entities on what is the definition. But as this definition was put forward, I think the clarity is already there. And it's just the grammar that people need to realize and follow. There is no period. These are all commas. So you are looking at that score, ranking, number, and it all leads up to, and there still isn't a period yet. So those things, these types of things dealing with lifestyle choices, the freedoms, the customer choices that you want to be focusing on, as the chairman very clearly stated was in the intent of this legislation, that is what is used in the analysis. It cannot be used in the analysis of the bank personal and credit activities. So it's a clear flow there. We're not talking about what the necessity side is, the first two C's in the banking of the 3C, and that was just brought up. What we're trying to focus on is that don't go outside of the financial, don't go outside of that credit side. And so that when you are looking at this type of thing, as was mentioned earlier, who's the employer? Why is that important here? The importance is don't discriminate against somebody because they happen to work for or own a gun manufacturer, ammunitioning, work for payday loans. We all know what that choke point was all about. We've learned that lesson, and we need to keep that focus even into a greater side of things so that it's not because I work for or I am a political figure that I have a business that is not accepted by some forms of society, or that I work for or are affiliated with oil, gas, and coal. We are all well aware of those discriminations that are taking place all across this country. Now, our community banks, such as the gentleman that was up, that was speaking on that behalf, absolutely right. But here's the issue. Go back to the choke point. And if you were, affiliated, if you had a customer that was affiliated with, say, payday loans, and I bring this up because I was just speaking yesterday with my community banker about these issues, and he said that they had regulators come in to his bank and they were spending days and days and days digging through every customer's portfolios. Well, in that, they had one person they started focusing on. Turns out that person had an affiliation with payday loans. That person ended up having to go through this banker was told, this is a customer you should be getting rid of. And he said, no, there ended up lawsuits until this all came to the forefront. And so we know this happens. And so we have to be careful with that type of thing. And so all this is going to prevent, it offers the guardrails for our community and state level banking to not have the pressures of those regulators. And what it does is, as was mentioned, that we have banks that are not interested in energy. Absolutely. Because if you go online, and this is in the supplemental testimony, the listing and sites that you can click on and see this, but they have written in Bank of America, Blue Ridge Bank, Citibank, Chase Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, every one of them have written in there that they will not do business with fossil fuels in one form or another. So this is a really critical point, because we want those guardrails up for these state level banks to be able to have a pushback. Your state lawmakers have stated you can't do this to us. And that's what's a critical point to this.
Oh, so on that point, so, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, don't we have to be a little bit careful? Doesn't this start to raise, this starts to raise, we start to create additional protected classes. And so, obviously, I think all of us can agree that no one should be denied banking or banking services or loans simply based on the color of their skin, on their race. But as you go down this list, this list can get quite long, and ultimately I understand it's a First Amendment right, but at the same time, and there are limits to all First Amendment rights. We all understand that. And it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for your exercising your First Amendment rights, but aren't there also some, if we're really raising this to a protected class, and yet and I think one of the things we've also learned in the last few years through the United States Supreme Court is even corporations have some form of free speech in their own regard. So how do we do this, or just interested in your thoughts, if you have any, about on how do you strike that balance between the right of a business to establish its clientele and to make some social statements that they're inclined to make, and others can make other social statements. There are some rights that corporations do have to express themselves. How do we balance those in your mind?
I think it's very interesting question, in that our First Amendment rights should be in a protected class, just as you did in putting the Second Amendment.
They're not always protected. And how do you balance that? Like I say, corporations have the ability, they have free speech rights as well. And how do you balance that? Why is the individual depositor's free speech rights, why do they exceed the right of the bank for its First Amendment rights?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that point is that when you have, as I listed off, all those banks, when they collude against the individual, then we have to put up some form of a barrier of that protective right.
But we have no evidence of collusion in the banks that are before us, which are state chartered banks. We have no evidence of collusion in that regard.
Well, Mr. Chairman, in that, most, if you were to ask them, they do have an affiliation with these majors because they are having a corresponding banking relationship with them. They have corresponding relationships for services and product. And so there's the opportunity for these banks to tell them through pressures of regulation, or when they have their regulators coming into their banks for review. And that's where that pressure will come from the collusion from above.
Okay.
Another simpler way to put this would be a McDonald's. McDonald's has decided, this large corp has decided, we're going to do ESG scoring. But gosh, we're not meeting those scores the way we need to. So we're going to turn to Simplot, because Simplot's who we buy all of our potatoes from. Well, Simplot doesn't have the potatoes. They have contracts with potato growers. So they turn to their potato growers and say, you have to do something to prove that you're less carbon, you're not producing too much carbon, you're doing all the environmental things that need to be done. And all of a sudden it is down to the individual farmer who now has to do a second rotation of crop, of cover crop, to show that they're eliminating carbon. They have to switch equipment to have lower carbon output. They can't use certain fertilizers because of carbon inputs. So that's how this system works. And these bankers know this because they have seen the pressures before. I can't believe that they did not feel anything from choke point.
All right, thank you. Is there anything else for us?
No, Mr. Chairman, unless you had any other questions for me. I guess one other thing that I would point out, as much as these bankers, love them dearly, because that's why I'm trying to protect my community bankers and the community bankers around this nation. And that's why I had the conversations with them. Wyoming and North Dakota were really close together, and I'm North Dakota. I served in the North Dakota House for just over 17 years. So our director of mineral resources was just last week in a conference in Houston, and he came back because he was put out a report. He was told by the oil companies that they will now be pulling back from investing in North Dakota because of a flaring issue. These companies were being rated by ESG and can no longer do business there. Wyoming will be facing those same type of flaring issues as North Dakota did. And so this thing filters its way all the way down. And so the minerals issue, the coal and the oil and nat gas is critical in this whole fight because it comes from the top down. Credit unions, same thing. You guys are a great farming and ranching area. The National Credit Union Association has now said that they want to see ratings done on all loans dealing with climate risk. That's what the national office is now telling all the credit unions. Well, those credit unions that are the loans for your farmers and ranchers now have to move and have been moving from an 18-month review to a 12-month review so that they can look at climate risk from your farmers and ranchers. And I would have to think that you've all heard about how we have this move to get rid of the cattle, to decrease our beef, and to move towards the fake beef. It's very, very real. So I end with that, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that there's a way that you can see how this does affect you personally. Because when I get in my car and I start heading to drive to town, it's going to tell me before I've even said where I was going, it will tell me where how far it is and where, and it decides where I'm going. No different than when you went online and you looked up where to get your Wrangler jeans, and next website you were on, there it was popping up. Here's the best Wrangler jeans. They're tracking you. It's all happening. So this isn't tin hat. This is there. This is the opportunity to put guardrails up for your individuals in your state to be protected from this type of discrimination.
All right, thank you, Ms. Grant. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right, is there anyone else to testify in this bill? Anyone else to testify in this bill? All right, we'll close off public comment and we'll wait for Senator Kinski to come back. He had a good reason. Oh, do you want to come back up? Oh, come on up for a sec, if you wouldn't mind. Excuse me, Senator Whiteman. So. I have.
Trust me, I'm not sick. It's just last year's.
Since I had COVID, you know, we had a COVID a year ago.
Yeah.
We both did, and a little over a year ago. Ever since then, I have this. My throat gets dry.
Yes.
I have this dry cough.
Yes.
It doesn't have anything to do with being
Hasn't
sick.
gone
It just
away
has
yet.
to be-
So yeah, it sounds like I'm, never mind. Anyway, back on the bill.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm looking at this ball and I really am sympathetic. There's parts of this I like. I don't see how we get this. I don't know how this is enforceable right now. I don't know how the banks and the regulators deal with this right now. And
Yeah.
I agree. It's a real problem. And with respect to my friends in regard to the banking industry, they came in a couple of years ago on crypto, and we had some kind of the same things for different reasons on crypto. And we kind of found a way to go ahead, even though, and now they're, I don't know if they're on board, but we're finding an easy piece, at least, I think, as we move forward. And so, I mean, I understand our friends in the banks, and but I just right now, I don't know how we do this. I don't know how we get it fixed so it works. I think it's just I think the concept is an important concept, and it needs to get worked on. I'm not sure how we fix it with the time that we have, but anyway, anyway, those are just my thoughts. If you had some more, I wanted to see if you had anything.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the opportunity to kind of bring it all home. I do agree with you that this is a big lift in a budget session, and I didn't wait because I didn't want to wait too long, because this is happening so fast across the world. And actually, the social credit scoring system came out of China, communist China,
Yeah.
and that's how they track and regulate and really control their citizens. And it scares me to death that that's making a presence here in America. And I didn't want to come back next year and be like, I told you so, because this happened, because we hear testimony, well, we're not doing this. This isn't going to happen, so we don't need a bill. A lot of times we see things coming our way and we try to proactively head it off at the pass. And I think that's appropriate for what we do in this body, especially being a part-time legislature. We can't just call ourselves into special session anytime an issue comes up. We're in session when an issue comes up. We're here 20 days and then we're gone until next year. So we have to address real issues of the day in a timely manner that protect our citizens. So that's why I brought it during a budget session. I apologize for such a heavy bill in a budget session, but I really think it's important.
Well, I don't disagree with that. It's just, as you get there, how you do it is oftentimes just as important as what you do. And anyway, yeah, I appreciate it. No, I think it's a real issue. Go ahead, Senator Kinski.
Well, Senator Beitman, as you know, sometimes it takes the third or fourth try. That first try, it's often get the conversation going. And ordinarily, I'd vote to kick this out onto the floor, and you could try and amend it out on the floor, but I think there's probably too much work. This really should come back in a general session after, but you got a lot of good feedback here. But what bothers me is the people on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum from you and I are not hung up on things like just how precisely we do or do not impact industry. And it is spooky what's going on out there. I ran into a fella in our hometown that I said, what do you do? He says, oh, data, and then a conversation, he can tell you every car you ever owned, every address you ever had, it's unbelievable the amount of, and they take it from all these different places and tie it together. And it's a brave new world. And so I think there's merit to your idea, and I'd encourage you to keep going forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Senator Steinmetz.
I would echo my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee. And I came in thinking I really did want to support this bill, and I do support the concept, but I do feel like in a budget session, this bill needs a lot of work, and I want to see it go forward in a way that actually it can accomplish what you're trying to do with it, rather than us pass something that could cause problems too, because it's awfully broad. I'm struggling with some of the definitions in here, and I'm totally on your side and headed in the same direction you are. So for that reason, I would urge us to work on this more in the next session.
Thank you. All right. With that, committee, what's your pleasure? All right. The bill fails for lack of a motion. All right. Thank you, Bo.
Thank you, committee.
And, I just go back. I mean, Facebook, Venmo, Twitter, those like things, if those things start to be coming in and start to end up being the basis on which you receive a credit, you're getting credit or you get debanked. I mean, Venmo, those guys can kick you off these platforms now. And
GoFundMe.
my generation, my generation still has large sums of money in cash as banks and under their mattresses and buried in the backyard, ready for that day. But your generation and your kids' generation, that electronic transferring and those systems, they don't function. It doesn't happen.
Right. And my biggest fear is, luckily we have our Wyoming banks that'll have our backs. And, but what happens when there are no other options?
Yeah,
And then
you're
the whole-
right.
the whole banking system collapses.
I encourage you to continue to work on it. And if there's, if we can get this to, you're on minerals, aren't you?
Yeah,
And maybe, are you going to bring this up as an interim topic? in minerals?
absolutely.
And so, yeah, I think that's a good thing. And I'd like to see you guys take it up, or if they won't, continue to work on it and get a hold of this guy too. See if
You
there's
bet.
something, they're not happy about it, but if they're gonna have to live with it, they might
They'll come
help you
along.
get some
Mr.
good,
Chairman.
better
They're not that
language.
mean. Thank you.
Honestly, like I said, I think